our community. We
Yeah, sure.
is okay, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's totally fine.
Thanks, sir. So, welcome one and all. I'm very happy to invite and introduce Mr. Karthik Lakshman. Karthik Lakshman is a first generation entrepreneur who currently runs this firm called as Magic Crate. And some of you are not yet there, but some of us, like who have kids, we know Magic Crate. It has been one of the cool things that has helped keep our kids engaged. So, prior to starting his venture, Karthik did his engineering from Chennai and masters from Georgia Tech in the US. Spent about 12 years working in McKinsey and Coca-Cola and HP. And after that, since he started a food tech company, I think his current the after the food tech company, he's now working on food tech company was something like Swiggy. Is working on Magic Crate, and it has been growing along and growing up to valuations of more than 100 crore. So I'm very happy to invite Karthik and he to our webinar today. And he's also one of the person who has been supporting our ID 5102 course on the innovative entrepreneur. The second part of which is on venture creation. So I'm very happy to have Karthik. Thanks a lot for your time, and please go ahead.
Absolutely, sir. Yeah. Thanks for having me there. I'm super glad to be here. So as you can see, I am currently in my native, just from the woodwork on the backside. So this is one of the things as an entrepreneur that you get to do, which is make a quick call. So literally, what we did was around March 20, right when COVID hit, we made a call that this is going to become very large. So we gave notice to our landlord across both Bangalore and Chennai, handed back the office, and made the entire team work from home. So we practically have no office right now except for a warehouse. So I moved to my native about a week, 10 days back. I don't intend to come back to Chennai at least in the near future. With network, it's relatively easy to stay connected and make sure that the team is still functioning and the entire team is remote. So I'll spend a little bit of time kind of walking through my background, where I started, how did Magic Crate come about, and where we are today. And I'll try to tie this a little bit to how you should think about startups, how you should think about the environment that you need to set around it, and so on, right? So let me start with a little bit of background about myself. I did my engineering in Chennai. So I grew up in Chennai. I did my schooling in PSBB DAV, and I did my engineering at SRM. And 2001 is when I graduated from SRM. That at that point of time, it used to be University of Madras. So I graduated in mechanical engineering. I went to the US, did my master's at Georgia Tech. I did this in industrial engineering. I graduated in the year 2003. So this was right at the peak of the dot-com bubble. This was 2001 to 2003. So the market was very different when I left for the US and when I really graduated. So when I graduated, getting a job was relatively hard. So it meant that I had to first get out of university, take an internship with GE. I spent a few months there. This was post-graduation, right? So after my graduation, I spent a few months as an intern, and then I kind of landed myself in a job with Coke. So Coca-Cola is headquartered in Atlanta, which is where Georgia Tech is. It's right across the campus from Coke, and a lot of graduates do end up there. Coke is a very it obviously has a very long history, right? So it's been around for hundreds of years. Has a deep brand and product that it has built out. So I spent about 2 years there. Now these first 2 years are definitely about understanding what it is to work, what it is to get something done. I was an internal consultant there. So when I say internal consultant, this was almost like a role where my primary job was to move into different functions and help different functions work better, in say. And I was primarily operating on the service side of Coke. So this was a lot of shared services, their own bottling plants, and so on. I spent a couple of years there. But after the first 2 years, I realized that I found corporate very slow. Um, Now, Coke is a company which typically starts at 8:30 in the morning, and at 5 o'clock everybody leaves the office. At 6 o'clock they turn off the AC. They ensure that nobody stays behind. So at 23, 24, I found work very, very boring. So I said I needed something interesting. I started looking for options, and at that point of time, I landed an offer with McKinsey doing consulting. So this was a strategy consulting role, and I was based out of LA for about 5 years. I started in the year 2005 until about 2010. I was with McKinsey. So this, I think, was where a lot of my foundational elements around what I learned got set in place. Around how do I tackle a problem? How do I problem solve when I start with something? How do you structure the problem around it? How do I look at a solution? How do I deal with clients? McKinsey is a place where we give you a quick sense of what that is. I don't know how many of you are aware of this company, but there is an entirely large industry of what is called management consultants. Their job is, in a very quirky way, it is told, we take clients' watches and tell them what the time is. To an extent, it is true, right? So we are brought in to analyze a particular situation and figure out what is the right answer. Now, in a lot of cases, we are not the experts in the game, because let's say I pick an example. One of the engagements was working with a very large semiconductor industry company, which is almost like I can say the biggest, and you can guess which company it is. It is that company, helping them figure out what is the future of the RAM industry, and this was in 2007. What is the future of the RAM industry? Should they really stay in it, or should they leave? And if they leave, then what do they do with the facilities and the business that they built up, which is about a $2-3 billion business at that time? Now, see, they obviously understand a lot more about the RAM industry than we do. But what they're looking for is an external perspective around what is going on. Where is the industry headed? And they're looking for a very structured approach. So the way this gets set up is there's a team of roughly about 3 to 4 people which get assembled. There'll be one expert who understands the industry, but the rest of us used to be pure play problem solvers, structurers. So we would be put in the job. We would analyze the industry, do a lot of market research, understand what is happening. Then we would do a lot of research within the company, talk to a lot of people, develop a perspective, take it as a recommendation back to the leadership team. Typically, McKinsey's projects are led by the CEO of the company or the COO. So it is the ask comes from pretty on the top. So so they're looking for direction around what should I do, and they're not looking at us as experts of the space, but as essentially experts at problem solving. So what McKinsey taught me was, how do I analyze a problem? How do I look at it? How do I break this out into different chunks and kind of look at each part, figure out what the answer is for each part, then put all of this back together, synthesize, and get to a final answer. So so if you look at this is a little bit of core of how most corporate jobs in reality work. This is something which is very different from how when you're a student, you have a certain sense of how corporate works or companies operate. The reality is entirely different, right? So apart from Excel, PowerPoint, and a few very basic tools, the reality is most companies don't use any sophisticated tools. They're just looking at people to figure out how to get to the answers. They're not really doing any kind of simulation or statistical analysis or deep research and so on. A lot of corporate and a lot of running companies is essentially around gut experience and excellent PowerPoint. That's pretty much it. And the 5 years that I spent at McKinsey kind of helped me understand a lot of how to do that really, really well. And it also allowed me to kind of explore a lot of what I was capable of, where my gaps are, what do I really need to get better at. So when you start doing one of these roles, it helps you kind of get yourself to be more well-rounded, to understand what do you need to get better at. So for example, one of the places which McKinsey used to constantly point out to a gap in my my profile at that point of time used to be, I had an issue with conflicts, right? And I think that's a little, I would say it's a little common for Indians as a whole, in that we try and avoid conflicts. We don't look at conflict as something which is positive. We look at it as a negative. We look at it as how do I get away from it, or how do I stay away from conflicts. But as a consultant, one of the things which I realized very quickly was conflicts are a nature of the job, because you are going in to tell somebody that they're doing something wrong and they need to be doing it differently, which means you're constantly in a sense in a state of chaos or conflict. So how do you kind of embrace that and use that as momentum towards getting what you need done, right? So I learned a lot of things like that in my 5 years at McKinsey. Now, so 2005 till 2010 was where I stayed at McKinsey, and I came out of McKinsey in 2010, early 2010. And the reason for coming out of McKinsey was predominantly the work life in McKinsey is pretty hard. It was perfectly fine as an individual, but I got married at that point, and it was quite unsustainable in the sense that you would be traveling every Monday to Friday, and you would be going to a different place for every month, for every week. So it's very hard to really create a work life around it, and you're predominantly working something like 16-hour days. So this would mean you would start the day at around 9:30. You would go to the client side. You would work with the client till about 6:30, 7. You would come back to your hotel room, get a quick dinner, finish out by around 8:30, and again sit down to get your work done or prep for the next day from 8:30, 9 o'clock till about 1:30. And this was the schedule for almost 5 years straight. So that kind of set me up for a lot of grueling schedule. And a lot of people typically shy away from this. I would say if you are able to get one of these opportunities early in your career, you should take it, because it kind of sets yourself up for a lot of this in the future. It's easiest to learn when you are in your 20s. As you get older, it's just generally harder to pick one of these roles and do. So 2005 till 2010, I did this. I came out of McKinsey and I joined Hewlett Packard. So HP at that point of time was going through a big transition. So a lot of you may be relatively young to understand what was happening at that time. But HP is a company that you know of as a laptop manufacturer. So HP at that point of time was a single entity. It had 4 different divisions. There was a business which was entirely about enterprise. And when I say enterprise, I'm talking predominantly enterprise hardware. This is storage, servers, networking devices. The second was there used to be a PC division, which was the entire laptop and desktop industry. The third one is HP printers. And the fourth one was a company that HP had acquired in the year 2001, 2002, which used to be called EDS, which is a large service wing. So you can almost think of that as a competitor for an Infosys or a Wipro, but slightly more ITES than IT. So HP was a $120 billion company when I joined them. And this was when they were going through a very rough period between 2010 to 2012. I joined them in corporate strategy. So this was a team which was assigned to help the CEO of HP make a lot of decisions around how the company should be run, how it should grow, and so on. So in this period of 2 years, between 2010 to 2012-13, HP, we decided to split HP into different smaller companies. So HP now is broken down into different companies. The service division is combined with another entity. The software division is called MicroStrategy. HP, the original HP was broken into a HP Enterprise and an HP Incorporated. So there are 4 different companies which got created over the 2 years. So this was again an interesting period to try and explore a lot of my personal skills around conflict management. How do you quickly make decisions, and how does a board really operate? Because this entire period I was reporting into a team. We were a team of roughly about 15 people which reported into the board, and the board would constantly make calls around what they should be doing. And this again meant very similar to my consulting lifestyle, where the board would meet in the morning, and then late evening it would come back to us. We would pick up the data which is needed, put it together, and then start looking at how do I analyze this. A lot of interesting anecdotes from that time. So, for example, one of the pieces which we were grappling with was, see, when you're splitting a company as large as HP, you cannot really disclose that information to the broader audience. So we had to figure out what would happen if the company gets split without any intelligence, which meant I can't go and talk to any of the business owners and ask them what happens if you split the business. But we need to start with first principles around, okay, so if you split the company, then there's going to be this synergy, essentially in places which are focused around sourcing of material. So let's say HP used to buy a lot of its processors from Intel, and at that point of time, our bill with Intel was roughly about $10-12 billion. So what would happen to the bill in the of $10-12 billion if you split the companies? Who would gain, who would lose, and what would be the magnitude of the problem? You had to assess this without talking to Intel, nor could you talk to the business owners who were running the business. So, so a lot of these pieces are what I focused on in the 2 years. Now, 2013-14, I moved back to India. So when I moved back to India, I was very clear that I wanted to start something on my own. So to give you a little bit of background about my family, I got married in 2009. My father used to be the head of marketing for a company called Spic, which some of you might have seen the office in Guindy. So he used to be the head of marketing there, and he came out of corporate in his 40s and started his own business and ran it very successfully. And one of the things which I've seen him do really well is transition from corporate to entrepreneurship. And I always had an interest in moving out of that and building something on my own. So starting 2010, I had an interest of starting something on my own. And the second thing was India as a country was a lot more interesting for me than the US when I talk about it from a startup perspective. Predominantly because a lot of the Indian startup industry was still very nascent at that time. It still is nascent, but if you think about 10 years back, 2010-11, it was super nascent. And hence, the way I looked at it was, there were a lot of interesting problems which are not being solved for in India as opposed to, let's say, the US. So 2010 to 12, I was in the Bay Area, so I had a lot of exposure to startups there. But what I quickly figured out was in the US, startups were super niche. So, for example, when I looked at this in 2010, there wasn't a Swiggy, there wasn't an Ola, there wasn't a large e-commerce provider apart from Flipkart, which is still very nascent. Amazon hadn't entered the business. So a lot of very basic elements which are required from a logistics perspective, consumer perspective, was not in place. And that felt a lot more interesting from a space perspective as opposed to the US, where they had all the basic things already up and running. So it is almost about how do I make this slightly more efficient. So the problem that you could pick was not about, how do I rent furniture and make this effective, but more about how do I pick furniture rental for one particular part of the market. Let us say it is only for rental of appliances for party purposes. That is a space which somebody would pick in the US and run it as a startup because that itself was a large enough market for them to go after. And you would already have somebody who was playing e-commerce, somebody else was playing the regular rental. So you had to pick a niche which made sense. So eventually what ended up happening was you had to pick very, very small niches to work on. Whereas in India, you can actually pick the entire space and say, I want to go after this. So from that perspective, India, China, a lot of developing markets have a lot more interesting problems left to be solved. Whereas the developed markets have a lot of those already solved for, or at least they have already been moved from a unorganized to the organized sector. So the move isn't as interesting as you would find in India. So that was kind of what I felt in 2010-11. So I always had an interest in moving back to India and starting up. So I moved in 2012-13 back to India. When I moved, I kind of transitioned along with HP to ensure that I had a relatively smooth transition back to India. Because obviously, when you're out of the country for about 10 years, you're not used to a lot of things which people here understand really well. So transitioning with HP helped me with that. I spent a couple of years with HP before I quit. So 2014 is when I really starting up. So from a startup perspective, the first problem that I picked was food tech. So this was 2014 when there used to be a company called Tiny Owl. So Tiny Owl was based out of Bombay, which had just picked up a problem, which was how do I get food from restaurants delivered at home? So that was the same problem that I picked, except that I picked a slightly more niche problem, I would say. Hindsight, the problem that I picked was, how do I get um, the whole restaurant experience to be more effective, both from an ownership perspective and from a customer perspective. So the problem that I started with was, can we have some kind of pre-ordering mechanism where people are able to order the food ahead of time before they hit the restaurant, so the whole restaurant experience is quicker. Because from a restaurant perspective, if you think about it, they are selling food, but they're also selling space. Because in a lot of cases, your real food or eating time is restricted to about 2 hours in the afternoon and 3 hours in the evening. So this is between 12:30, 1 o'clock till about 2:30, and about 7 till about 10. So the space is always a constraint, and space is your largest part in a restaurant, in the restaurant industry. So I said, can I make this more effective? Can I create a pre-ordering mechanism, especially for lunch around offices, where people could pre-order the lunch and then visit the restaurant to place the order? Now, here is one of the things which a lot of you may end up with when you start looking at ideas, right? Now, I would say this idea is pretty interesting even today. I don't think there is somebody who's looking at this problem. Now, from a restaurant owner's perspective, this is obviously a problem I want to solve, because if I look at it from an overall problem of how do I scale my restaurant, space is one of the largest constraints, apart from the whole food and the quality of food. The part which hindsight I didn't do a good enough job of was understanding whether people really wanted this problem solved. See, in a lot of cases, when you come up with solutions for problems, you should start looking at just status quo as your competitor. So if you look at this space, right? Even today, there is no real solution for it. Though Swiggy and Zomato exist, nobody is really going after making the restaurant experience smoother. It still is as cumbersome as it was in 2015. Now, on one side, you look at this and say, okay, I can make this more efficient. On the other side, the question is, do people care about it enough to actually fix the problem? Or is it one of those inconveniences which people will just learn to live with? In a lot of cases, the reality is people will learn to live with inconveniences because it is not just that important. And when you start picking startup ideas, you need to start really assessing, am I going after a real problem, or am I just kind of going after a problem because I find it very interesting to solve, right? So when you're starting up, a lot of times the problem that you're picking up does not exist. And this is a little hard to assess. Now, this is one of those things which second time, third time entrepreneurs get much better at, because you get tuned to look at the market a lot more carefully. But as a first time entrepreneur, it's a little hard. So I would say, if any of you are already running startups or are working on ideas, go back and assess the idea a little bit more on whether, is this a problem which is real, which obviously I think you would have done, but is this the problem that people want solved? Are they willing to put any energy towards solving it? And is it going to help people enough that they are willing to change status quo and move to this answer, right? And this also has a lot to do with timing. So for example, you may be ahead of the market. So if you look at e-commerce as an example, there used to be a company called India Mart, not India Mart. Forget India. I can't remember the name of the company. I find it offline. But this was an e-commerce company which was started in the year 1997, 98, and by the time Flipkart really came into existence, they had already died. They were right. The idea was right, but they're just so ahead of the market that the market has not matured for you to really build out something. So assess two things. One is, do people care about it? Are people worried about it enough? Are they willing to change status quo and fix this? Number two, is the timing right? Is the environment around this right? So for example, if I take a space like mine, today a lot of startups are looking at edtech and how do I provide video-based teaching or education setting for children sitting at home. Now there are a bunch of startups which started between 2000 to 2015. Most of them failed. Now, if you look at it from the problem perspective, the problem was real because people wanted the education, but the issue was you didn't have internet which was strong enough for this kind of communication. you couldn't just sit at home and join one of these classes. Infrastructure was super broken. So even though there was interest from people to solve the problem, even though the solution existed, it required the critical infrastructure to develop, and a lot of that developed because of Jio. Because Jio made the data prices so cheap, the Indian data price overall fell so much that it actually became viable to run this kind of large-scale networks. So also look at the climate when you're starting the business. It is so the general opinion of a lot of people who have been in startups and VC industry for a very long period of time is, if I had to choose between getting the startup idea right, getting the team right, and getting the timing right, typically timing wins. If you can time the answer or time your startup right, there is a very, very high chance that almost like water level, it lifts everybody up, and everybody who's in the space at that point of time wins, as opposed to going at a hard problem at the wrong time with a brilliant team. Now, obviously, this is not something that you can time, right? So as a startup founder, you want to time it, but it's also not something that you can really time well. It's a little bit of hindsight after the fact that you can go back and judge whether the timing was right or wrong. But you should constantly be open to the idea that the timing may be wrong, and you just have to keep reassessing it, right? So back to where I started. So 2014, I launched this startup. Now, when I launched the startup, again, one of the things which commonly happens is, if people in this group are working on ideas, the most critical thing I would tell you is take the product to the market very, very quickly. And when I say very quickly, take it before you think you're ready for prime time. It is best that you ideally take the product to the market in about max 2.5 months. Now, a lot of you may be working on ideas for much longer. So in a lot of these cases, I would say curtail your, let's call it, desire to perfect the product. Take it to the market, let the market tell you whether the need is there, and then you can figure out whether you need to perfect the product or not. To give you an example, it took me 4 months to launch the first, sorry, there's a question from Satya. I think I missed it. How do we look at timing?
No.
So, Satya, this is
I mean, in the process, you can explain. I just want to put it in there so that this is a question I've been struggling with last 5-6 years. So maybe I'll get some answers from you.
Got it. So timing is an extremely hard problem to solve, right? I would say, and I'll tell you why this is also difficult. To start up a company, you need to have a ridiculously high amount of EQ and IQ to say, I don't care what people think, I'm just going to start up and build this business. So one of the things which you end up doing very frequently is disregarding advice of others who tell you something which is counter to your belief, right? And that is how you're built as an entrepreneur. Now, hence, when you go and talk to people and they tell you that the timing for the startup is not right, it is hard to take. That's a simple answer, right? You almost feel like, I would rather disregard this and hope that they are wrong, as opposed to believing that you are wrong.
That's the question I was trying to ask. Like, it's an advice you cannot just take.
Correct. It is an advice you don't want to take as an entrepreneur because you feel that I don't like that answer, right? I will tell you how to find that, though. It is not very difficult if you look at it for the right spots. So the simplest way to look for timing is almost looking at it from a product market fit perspective. So let me kind of fast forward a little bit, right? Okay. So my first startup took almost 4 months to launch. And when I launched the product, I kind of had built everything up. I had built the back end, I had built the front end. I spent a little bit of time talking to restaurant owners, but I would say hindsight, not enough. I launched the product. I figured out the traction was very, very weak. And when I say very weak, there were enough people willing to talk about it, but there was not enough takers and not at a pace that I liked. It didn't just fly off the shelf. So I said, if it's not flying off the shelf, maybe I should look at a slightly different idea. The second time I picked a different idea, and the idea was was almost Swiggy. And when I say Swiggy, I'm not talking about Swiggy Core, but Swiggy Pop. So this was, how do I tie up, small scale mom and pop shops who are focused on providing food for people with people looking for home food, and how do I become the platform for that? So, so when I picked up this as a problem, uh, I learned from my first mistake. So I didn't spend 4 months building the the solution. I took about 20 days to build out a solution. So literally in 20 days, we launched the product and we took it live. Now, when we took it live, it immediately took off both on the provider side and on the customer side. Customers were looking for food at about 100 rupee price point. There were enough providers willing to cater to that demand. The market existed, and all it required was us to bring the platform in. Now, that is what you're looking for from a timing perspective. So to an extent, it's almost like the timing is right if you're able to see very rapid traction on the problem without having to really go and hit the wall and break it and get through. You can do all of that. It's not that you cannot. But the point is, there has to be natural traction which starts giving you tailwinds. And then you're working on creating more momentum on it. If you feel that the going is really, really hard and nobody seems to understand the problem, nobody seems to care about the problem, most likely either your question is something which people don't care about, or your answer is not right, or the timing is not right. And this is where I think an experienced entrepreneur who can act as a guide for you for the first, let's say, 6 months can actually help very, very quickly get to the answer on which of these three is it. Right? So the second time when I launched, it took off very rapidly. I was able to see scale, and within about 30 days, we were doing about 100 orders a day. And then I hit the point where on one particular day, when we had the maximum number of orders, which was something around 175 orders on a single day, it just went haywire. The entire network crashed. Food was not delivered for anybody on time. Customers were on call the entire lunchtime. This was at lunch. Customers were on call the entire time, and none of my providers were taking the phone. And I started realizing that there is a fundamental issue in the model. And the issue is, I was predominantly dealing with mom and pop kind of people. When I say that, it's usually like the mother would cook, the father and the first son would deliver the food. They don't care about scaling it beyond a certain size. So they are happy delivering about 20 to 30 lunches. That's a sweet spot. They don't want to grow beyond that. And my ambition was to grow to about thousands of lunches. So I figured out that the only way to solve this problem meant that I would have to get into the actual business of food production and delivery. Now, when I started the food tech, one of the things which I had kind of mentally set by myself as the barriers was I wanted to stay a pure play tech company. I didn't want to get into blue collar management, nor did I want to get into food production, because they are entirely different games. And I was clear that I was not set up, both from a background perspective, nor from a mental stamina perspective, into going and solving those two problems. So that day I quit that business, right? So this was 175 orders. I had a team of roughly about 15 people. I had bootstrapped. We were very close to break even positive, but I figured out that the only way to get past and grow this business would mean I would have to take this up and run it. And I was not ready to do it. So I shut down that business, despite the fact that my entire staff were not in agreement for it. So I said, this is a business, it is viable. It is just not my business. I don't feel a good fit for this, because food production is a very, very different game, right? Now, if you look at the other pieces of the business, even today, food delivery is a super difficult problem to solve from a unit economics perspective. Just to give you a sense of how this works, the average food delivery guy charges about, or costs about 1,000 rupees per day. That's the cost of running a guy, which is about 25,000 of wages plus petrol and conveyance and so on. So it costs you about 30,000 per person, which means 1,000 a day just for covering the food delivery guy. Then you have the overhead and so on. let's assume that you have about 500 rupees more of overhead. You need about 1,500 rupees of revenue to get to that. And let's assume that the average ticket size of an order is 300 rupees and you get a 10% cut rate. It used to be 10% at that time, which means for a 300 rupee food delivery, you would get 30 rupees. To get to 1,000 rupees, you need about 33 deliveries. And 33 deliveries are almost impossible to achieve because your delivery time is only about 12 to 2:30 and between 7 and 10. So in this 5 hours, it's very hard to get to 33 deliveries. Even today, the economics for Swiggy or Zomato is pathetic. They continue to sink in a ton of VC money, and they have not really figured it out. But VCs continue to sink money into this, hoping that at some point of time they'll figure out how to solve this problem. But the reality is, it's a very, very hard problem to solve, right? So this was late 2014 when I decided that I wanted to continue to start up, but this was not my cup of tea. So at that point of time, now if you kind of look at time frame, but in this time, I started in 2014 January or so. By December, I had picked a problem, dropped it. I picked a problem number 2, I dropped it. I was on problem number 3 by October, November of 2014. So the reason I'm telling you this is, see, as an entrepreneur or as a founder, you are obviously very close to the idea. You want the idea to work. But you also need to see reality of what is happening from market perspective. Do not keep, your idea is not your baby, right? Because if you look at it as your baby, you will never let it go. So you have to look at this in a very impartial way to say, I'm looking at the idea to assess whether this is viable. And if it is viable, I'll figure out how to create a solution for this. And that's the best way to look at this, to ensure that you're not burning yourself in the entire process. You will burn yourself. Not to say that you're not going to burn yourself, but you better burn yourself in the right way and in the right problem, right? So the third problem that we picked was, and I at that point of time, I already had a sales and marketing team. I had a tech team in place. I kind of understood how to run a startup. I knew that speed was very, very critical. Traction is critical. Being able to very quickly pivot is critical. So I combined forces with one of my old friends from high school. His name is Vishwanath. So Vishwanath and I went to school together. This was in the year, this was in the mid 90s. Right? So we went to school together. I knew him for a long period of time. He worked for a startup called Tutor Vista, which was eventually acquired by Pearson. So he had picked up this idea, which is Magic Crate. So he had already built out a prototype. He was testing this out with friends and colleagues and so on. And that's when we kind of got together. So, and we have been doing this business for the last 5 years. So we started off Magic Crate we launched the business in 2015 January, and we ran Magic Crate exclusively until COVID hit, which was until March of 2020. And when COVID hit, we were doing about 2.25 crores of sales a month. And we were unit profitable. We were still sinking in a little bit of money on fixed cost when COVID hit. So let me talk a little bit about something like COVID, right? See, in an environment like that, so let us, so I'll give you a quick snapshot of what it looked like in 2020 March, roughly around the 20th. I had a workforce of roughly about 200 people, and roughly around March 20th, COVID hit, and we knew that this was going to get worse. There is a very high chance of lockdowns. There is a very high chance that e-commerce will not function, and we had to be decisive about a set of actions that we take. So on one side, you've spent almost 5 years building a business, so you do not want the business to hurt. On the second front, you have a set of employees who have really quit possibly lucrative jobs, other companies, and worked with you, and and you want to protect them. On the third piece, you obviously have the personal side to take care of, right? So this is a complex situation which required us to really look at what do I care about, how do I optimize, and what do I really do. The worst thing that you can do for yourself in one of these situations is be very optimistic. So the framework that we used was to say, if we are optimistic, and COVID washes through very quickly, we are good. If we are optimistic and COVID really worsens the situation, then we may be in a position where we have to shut down the business. Alternatively, if we are pessimistic and COVID turns out to be really bad, then we are fine. If we are pessimistic and COVID washes through very quickly, then we are possibly let go of an opportunity. So we said across all of these pieces, the best framework to use was actually to be pessimistic in the scenario. So we said we will assume the worst. We'll assume e-commerce will shut down. We'll assume we are going to have no recovery for the next 12 months. We assume that business has to survive with a core set of people. So we very quickly made a set of calls. We let go of a certain part of the workforce, gave them about 2 months of notice. We let go of our real estate. We let go of a set of things that allowed us to significantly cut back on our expenses, which ensured that the core team survives and gets through. So now we are in a position where the entire workforce has come back fully operational. We are able to do all of our shipments, and we are kind of back to usual, right? But one of the things which I want to emphasize here is, as an entrepreneur, you are very frequently making very, very hard calls that you don't like, calls which are very different from your natural tendency. My natural tendency, I don't know if you can see on the call, but my natural tendency is to actually figure out how to mentor and grow people. Now, in this scenario, that's not possible, right? I had a choice of either I can let the company go down and the entire workforce goes under and everybody has to look for a job, or I have to let go of 30% of the workforce and kind of wish them well, help them find other jobs, but save the remaining 70% and save the company. So some of these calls you'll have to make when you're in situations like these. That's kind of what we went through. Currently, we are in a position which is significantly better. We have about a 60-70% recovery compared to our original numbers. We're at 1 crore plus in terms of numbers that we'll hit this month. But the second thing that we have done is we have also used the opportunity in the last shutdown period of April to launch a new product called Masterclass, and this is one of the products which I've been working with Satya and the team at IIT around the second product that we wanted to launch. So, a quick recap on Magic Crate. Magic Crate is a activity box essentially focused on helping children learn different skills. The second product that we launched is called Masterclass. This is teaching different skills and activities for children using digital means with a child sitting at home. So almost think of this as hobby classes. The most popular classes right now that we are running are Learn to Code. There's a class on machine learning. There is one on chess. There is one on higher order thinking skills. These are all popular courses that we're currently working on, right? So the second thing which I'll talk about is the fact that when you have responsibility towards a lot of different stakeholders, be it your company, your employees, and so on, you'll have to fix on some things which you say I cannot give up on. And in this case, it had to mean that the company cannot be given up on. So we had to figure out how do we solve for the other pieces around it, right? Now, so 2015 to 20 is when we spent the majority of the time building out the company. So we raised about roughly 4.5 million of venture funding during this period. We raised it from a bunch of different VCs. So the venture industry is something that you can kind of navigate when you get to the point. I think most of you are still away from there. So we'll go back a little bit to what matters from a scaling perspective, right? So I think a lot of you are probably in idea stage or very, very early stage. So the first thing that Satya talked about was Satya asked for was timing. So how do you ensure that your problem is right? How do you ensure that your solution is right? How do you ensure your timing is right? No simple answers, but traction typically tells you whether the answer is right or not. You want to see a lot of traction. You want to see customers quickly adapting to the solution. You want to see the solution really taking off. Please do not use your family or your friends or anybody as guinea pigs, because typically they'll give you biased answers, be it positive or negative, right? So your close friends will tell you your answer is brilliant. Your haters will tell you this will never work. You're not going to get kind of unbiased views. So the best is go to the market, put it in front of people and see what the reaction is, and slowly figure out whether this will scale or not. Okay. Now, so I spent a little bit of time talking about what it means to scale from, let's say, idea stage to getting to product market fit. See, as a I'm assuming a lot of you are aspiring to be founders. Yes, as founders, there are only two roles. Now you can be good at various things, but you're either a product guy or you're a sales and marketing guy. Now there is nothing else which requires a founder to really be good at when they start. Now when you create a company or when you start with the product, you need strength on both these areas. It can either be you are good at both, or you have a co-founder who's good at the other. But please don't disregard any of these two pieces. One of the things which I think this team is very likely to end up with, and something that you need to guard against, is do not look at product as your primary thing that you're selling. You still have to figure out how do you do sales and marketing, right? If you create a product, it's not going to sell unless you market it. It is not going to sell unless you have a sales team surrounding it. And this cannot be given off to a third party saying they will do the job. It is a founder's job to figure out how to sell. And if you are not able to sell, it's almost like if I, as a founder, am not able to sell my product, it is very hard for you to expect somebody else to sell the product, right? So as a founder, there's only these two roles. Either you're a product guy or a sales and marketing guy. And you can figure out of these two roles what you are. Everything else, you can either get experts or you can learn as you go along. And what do I mean by everything else? Recruiting. So HR management, all of those pieces. Finance, managing your finances, fundraising, all of those can be managed as you go along. Product and technology, very, very hard to outsource. Now, in my company, I have outsourced tech because neither me nor my co-founder are hardcore techies. We have a hardcore tech team, but the person who runs tech is almost like a founder. He's been with me for the last 4 years and he operates like a founder. So if you don't have somebody who operates like a founder, you're going to have trouble. But I think a lot of you are aspiring techies, so I don't think you'll have that as an issue. But an issue that you're likely to see a lot more, that I expect to see a lot more from this team, is you might look at sales and marketing as something that you can outsource to somebody else. It's very tempting, right? It's very tempting when somebody comes in and says that I will help you with sales and marketing. I can help you market your product. You need a little bit of budget. I can do digital marketing for you. Or I can find networks and partnerships and sell for you. Please don't get into that trap. Fundamentally, as a founder or as a founding team, somebody in the founding team has to be good at sales and marketing. You have to learn how to do that. You can have a brilliant product, but if you don't know how to sell it, it's not going to work, right? So this is the first thing that I kind of want to go back to, which is what skill do you need to have as founding team? Now, the second thing from a how do you kind of get from product to product market fit, and what typically happens during this phase? See, the most common thing as first-time entrepreneurs, a lot of people make the mistake of doing is you would pick one problem or one topic that you are good at, and you would build a solution around it. So let's take an example of, let's say one of you figures out how to build a super high quality fan, an inverter fan, right? So let's say you built a product which has a fan and which has a built-in battery, and it can last for, let's say, 24 hours, and this is significantly better than what the market currently has. Now, if I pick this as a product, now what do you need? You need a guy who's a hardcore techie, who understands products, who's able to build out this as a really good product, right? Second thing you need is you need a sales and marketing team or a sales and marketing founder who's able to build a team around them. How do you create the marketing collateral? How do you market this product? Where will it sell? Which geographies? How do you go and hit the distributors? And how do you sell this product, right? Now, very frequently what I see is there would be a founder, let's say a techie, who's good at something like solving for the supply chain complexity of this problem in a way. Let's say you're really good at solving that. Now, what ends up happening is you will build a solution for the supply chain component for 100x the scale of where you are today. Let's say you can produce about 100 units a day. You will build a solution for something like 100 times of that, which is when I need to produce 10,000 units, what should my supply chain look like? Let me solve for it today. This is the worst way in which you can waste your time. The simple way, the right way to go about this is to say, how do I look at 10x my current size? And how do I pick every function and move it to be ready for 10x my current volume? Okay, so let us say you have the capability to produce 100 units right now. Then I need my supply chain to be ready for 1,000 units. I need my distribution team to be able to sell 1,000 units. I need my material vendors or sourcing team to be ready for 1,000 units, and so on. Every team has to be ready for, let's say, 10x of your current scale, not beyond that. What that allows you to do is it allows you to solve for the scale at which you are, as opposed to the scale that you can grow to. And this is the simplest way or the easiest way for you to waste a lot of time between identifying the product and getting to product market fit. I don't know if I'm being super clear, so let me repeat this, right? So you have created a product, you think this product can sell, you think currently I can sell 20 of this. Now you want to build a capability to be able to sell 200, no more than 200. If 200 can be sold with just an Excel list of all your invoices, that is perfectly fine. Please don't build a technology to be able to scale to 2,000 and 20,000. An Excel list is perfectly fine. You don't need a complex CRM. When you need a CRM, go to a CRM. So don't backfit solutions for the scale you will get to. Look for solutions at the rate at which you are. So the way you're looking for this is, let us say I have created a product. I can sell 20 units today. I want to figure out how do I grow this by 10 to 15% every month at a minimum. And I'm talking about, table stakes. Now, if you look at Y Combinator, which is one of the accelerators based on the US, they tell you to look for 10 to 15% growth on a week-on-week basis, which is this week, if you sold 20 units, you need to be looking at how do I grow to 22 to 23 units next week and 23 to 27 units the week after, and so on. Right? So they look at 10% week-on-week uplift. I'm telling you conservatively, look at month-on-month, about 15% growth. If you're able to achieve that, you will be able to very quickly figure out whether this product will scale or not. Don't build any solution for scale. When you get to scale, you can figure out how to solve all those problems. So what are you looking for? You're looking for, if my product is X, if I have figured out how to create the product, if I know how to sell the product, if I know sales and marketing, then how do I grow 10% week on week or at least month on month? And if I am not able to do that, then where am I going wrong? Is it a sales and marketing problem? Do people not understand what I'm selling? Is there a need for the problem? Or do people not care about the solution, or do I have the wrong solution? Now, it is very tempting to fake this as founders and kind of say that I've reached product market fit. But the thing is, you need to be kind of brutally honest with yourself on whether you think you've reached that or not. Right? What do I mean by product market fit? Let us say you are starting at 20, you have grown 10% week on week, and you're at week 8, and you're at, let's say, about 70 units a week. At that point of time, if I stop my sales and marketing efforts, will sales continue to climb up? Albeit a little slower. So if it, let's say, climb, it will continue to climb at about 5 to 6% just on word of mouth, then you have achieved some level of product market fit. If it will tank, the next week you're down to about 20 units, it basically means your people don't care about your problem or your solution enough. Because for the products which really work, the easiest way, the best way to build a marketing engine is word of mouth. And word of mouth only works if the product and the solution are right. That's the simplest way to measure this. Now, if I look at Masterclass, which we launched now, as opposed to Magic Crate, it took us a lot of time to achieve product market fit. It took us almost a year to get there. Masterclass, we think we have gotten there. We are 75% into product market fit in about 2 months now. We think roughly by August we'll have 100% product market fit. But as founder, you need to be really brutally honest with yourself on whether this is true or not. Am I kind of BSing myself that the solution is real and people care about it, or is it real, right? So please look at it from that perspective. So back to the kind of recap some of the pieces I talked about, right? So first thing is, before starting up, kind of make sure that you have set up your environment around you to ensure that you will succeed. You need to have a certain amount of backing around yourself. Point one. Point number two is, pick a problem you're passionate about. Make sure that you're willing to work on this. And please don't pick problems which are interesting today. You may have to work on this for the next 10 years. So you better pick problems which are interesting for a long period of time. That's point number two. Point number three is, make sure that founders are there for technology or product and sales and marketing. Point number four, make sure that you're rapidly iterating and you're looking at how do I get to product market fit. If you're able to iterate very rapidly and get to product market fit, then the rest of it can be figured out. Whether you take VC money or not, whether is this going to become $1 billion startup or $100 million startup, all that are things you can solve for the later. I think this is your kind of starting point, pieces that you need to look for, right? I think we are almost on time, so I'll kind of wrap up at that. I know I kind of jumped multiple topics, but if there are questions, happy to answer them.
Karthik, thanks a lot. That was quite enlightening, I would say, because having gone through a bunch of startups myself and working with a lot of teams, retroactively or retrospectively, I can really figure out how we have missed a few things. Now, I wanted to ask you one question. How much of this wisdom that you have right now has come from your consulting job or the job that you've done before you had over here? Because many of these teams here are just out of college, and I'm sure it only reflected wisdom and not natural wisdom.
Yeah. So the reality is almost none of what I just told you comes from consulting.
Okay, that is reassuring. That is reassuring, Karthik. Otherwise, it would have been quite scary.
No. See, consulting gives you a certain set of skills, but none of this, okay, right? So this comes only when you're running a startup and you're doing this for a period of time. So pretty much all of what I talked about is purely from a startup perspective, what I've learned in the last 4 or 5 years. And in fact, I would say I've had to unlearn a lot of things I learned as a consultant to ensure that it still works. I have a few questions. I'll kind of start handling them as we come along. How do you handle competitive pressure? See, competition is something which, in a way, you should keep tabs of your competitor, but the right answer is disregard. Don't worry about competition. See, we have a competitor who has continuously raised more money than we have, continues to burn a lot more money than we do, continues to have significantly more brand awareness than we do because the amount of marketing money they spend. But we don't care, because we believe that, and this is what all founders will tell you, is that I believe in my model of operation. I have a lot of, we believe that we are running the startup the right way, we are running the teams the right way, and eventually the execution takes care of itself. So don't worry about competition, keep tabs about what they are doing, make sure that you are tracking them, but don't worry too much about it, right? What are the challenges when a person shifts from a job to a startup? First thing I would say is, there are actually three different angles I can look at this. The first one is professionally, what does it mean? Second is financially. Third is from a society perspective. Professionally, you as a startup founder or a person even working in a startup, you need to be okay with a lot more ambiguity. Very few things are as cut and dried as a company would have. So you should be okay with a lot more ambiguity. You should be okay with the startup kind of driving its needs on you. So it's not like, so let's say you may be who wants to really learn sales and marketing, but the startup may require you to be a tech guy, and that means you will be a tech guy and you don't have a choice. So to take an example of myself, when we started Magic Crate, I had done almost no sales and marketing. I was a consultant, but that doesn't mean I'm doing sales and marketing. I've done very, very little direct sales and marketing. My co-founder is a guy who had done a lot of sales and marketing, but he had set up the product design perspective from a design perspective, which meant design had to run under him. So I had to pick the other role, which is sales and marketing. So over the last 5 years, I've kind of learned sales and marketing from almost zero to where I am today. So the startup will determine what you will learn. You cannot kind of mandate saying that this is what I want to learn, and hence the startup should give me the opportunity to do that. This whole concept of you should start up because you want to be your own boss is a horrible idea. Please get out of that idea. It never works like that. The reality is the startup determines everything, and you are its lowest level servant, right? So this is from a professional perspective. You have to be willing to make compromises. From a financial perspective, I would say set aside a certain amount of money to ensure that you will not starve, because the startup is not going to pay you for a very long period of time. It still doesn't pay me, or it doesn't completely pay me, right? I still take salaries when off and on, right? But when startup funds are a little tight, the first salary that I cut is mine. So for the last 12 months, I've not really taken money. I have a family. I need to figure out how to manage all of that. So the first thing that I did before I started up was I cut down all my expenses. I got out of loans. I brought my expenses down to bare minimum. And that is how I operate. So financially, make sure that you've kind of shrunk your needs significantly. Despite social challenges, please don't buy a house. Please don't get into loans. Please don't take car loans. Please don't take vehicle loans. All of those are things which will really inhibit you from starting up. The third piece is from a society perspective. The society generally looks at this as employed in a startup as glamorous, and running a startup not so much. So the best thing that you can do from a society perspective is keep it away from them. Don't talk about it. Majority of your relatives, friends don't care about it. So don't bring this up in common conversations. You have to be mentally strong to do that, because there is always the ego aspect of it, which will come up and say that I want to talk about my startup, but please avoid it. It leads to nothing positive. It leads to a lot more heartburn for you and for others. So from a society perspective, I would say keep it away. I never go to any of my friends or relatives or anybody for any kind of advice, funds, or whether they want to buy my product, nothing. Right? I keep them completely out of it. This is professionally, and my family gets to obviously experience it, but not outside. Right? So this is the set of challenges that you need to be mentally ready for when you're moving from a job to a startup. Right? If you're not ready for it, I would say take a job in a startup, see how it is before you jump in. And when I say startup, take a job in a company which has less than, let's say, 50 people. Anything above that is not really a startup. It is just a company with low maturity levels. If you want a real startup, you want to join in the first 10, 15 people. That is when you really get to experience what a startup feels like. After 50 people, it is almost like a low maturity enterprise. Right? Now, I had a question on how much set aside as social media expense, marketing as a percentage of entire expenses. Good question. So, see, this is where your space really comes into play, right? So I'll just drop some numbers so you're able to understand this. See, let us say that a company makes about 100 rupees of revenue, right? Now, if you have a physical product startup, and let's say the product costs you about, when I say product, let's call it COGS. Let's say the COGS cost you about 35 rupees to make, okay? Now, you are left with a gross margin of 65, right? Now, in the 65, you need to cover for sales and marketing, which typically will end up costing somewhere around 30 to 35 rupees, right? Fixed expenses 10 to 15. And when I say fixed expenses, I'm talking about your salary outside of sales and marketing, and your real estate expenses, your telco, and so on, right? So we look at this. If you start with 65, then you take sales and marketing out, which is about 35. You're left with 30. You spend about 15 on fixed expense. You're left with a net margin of about 15 rupees. This is what you're hoping to get to, right? But this is hope, and this is eventual. Even today, I'm not at this point, right? The first year essentially looks like this. If your revenue is 100 rupees and your COGS is 35, you are lucky if you can keep your sales and marketing expense to less than 35, to less than 65 rupees. Meaning, the term that is used is called unit economics positive, which means I should cover my COGS plus S&M from revenues. The reason people talk about that is, if you don't have that, let's say you lose 1 lakh for every 10 lakhs of sales. When your sales climbs to 10 crores, you lose about a crore. If you are losing on sales and marketing and gross margin, because that's a variable cost, right? So you need to ensure that by year 1, if you're able to get to this, which is your revenue is equal to COGS plus sales plus marketing. If you're able to get to this point, I think you're doing a pretty good job. Now, you will still burn your fixed expenses, which is about 10 to 15 rupees, but that's perfectly fine. That's the whole point of bootstrapping. Either you don't take the money out, meaning you don't take any salary, or you don't pay for real estate, you use your house and so on, or you kind of raise a little bit of money to account for it, right? How much is it easy or difficult to calculate sales and marketing figure accurately before a person begins a startup? Super hard, extremely hard. You almost never can, right? And plus, remember, sales and marketing, unfortunately, is not a fixed expense. Because if you think about it, from a sales and marketing perspective, if let's say I create a product which is entirely new for the market, let's take the product that I talked about, which is the inverter fan. There is pent-up demand, meaning there are people already looking for that solution. They will buy the product very, very quickly. So I may spend only 10 rupees acquiring a customer who's already looking for that product. But that will be true only for the first 1,000 customers. The next 1,000 customers may be kind of aware of their need, but don't want to spend the money. So you may have to spend 30 rupees per customer. The next set of customers, you need to educate them that they need a product like this. That may take 100 rupees a customer. The next set of customers may not believe that your solution even solves the problem. There you need to spend 300 rupees a customer. So sales and marketing cost, unfortunately, is not a fixed expense. It escalates over time. As you go deeper and deeper into the market, it keeps increasing. So there is the only real way to do this is to actually hit the market, understand what sales and marketing cost is, and then kind of work backwards, right? So today, for example, Masterclass has a very low sales and marketing cost, but I can't assume that that will be the case forever. It will escalate. So I need to account for a higher sales and marketing cost as it expands, as I go after the next customer. Please remember, your sales and marketing cost for customer X is always cheaper than X plus 1. True. So it's a very fair question, which is I talked about the fact that I left McKinsey for work-life balance, and the startup is worse. Very true. See, in my case, my work-life balance didn't get determined by working hours, but more by travel. Right? McKinsey required me to travel continuously, which meant that I had to constantly be away from family, which is what I was referring to. Work-life balance with the startup is significantly worse than McKinsey, for example. The hardest part for a startup is the fact that you can't really turn off. Right? It's not a switch on, switch off button. So I constantly keep getting this from my wife, which is, why do you keep thinking about this all the time? It's like, why can't you really come out of it? The reality is you can't. Right? When you are operating a business and when you're trying to figure out how to solve a problem, that problem really kind of engulfs you to an extent. So you don't really have a personal and professional life balance anymore. It's almost like your startup gets into your life at all points of time. The only thing which you can do is I still figure out how to kind of make sure that I'm around for my family when they need me. But the work life, purely from a time perspective, is significantly is worse in a startup than in a job like McKinsey. So, and that is something that you need to be prepared for. And if you're not ready for that from a personal life perspective, it's best that you don't start up at that point of time. So I would say pick times which are kind of ideal. So for example, if you're not married, you're single, it's very easy. But for example, don't start up right before you're getting married. It's a bad time. Because the last thing you want to do after you get married is to tell your wife that I need to be working on a startup and I just can't spend any time with you. Similarly, if you're going to have your first child, don't get into a startup. I think you guys are still significantly away from that point, right? But I'm telling you that at important points of time from a personal life perspective, don't start up at those points. And generally, startups are very intense for the first year and a half. Then it gets better, and then there are periods of intensity. It's not like it's flat. So my first year, 2015, was very intense. 16 was better. 17 was average. 18 was very intense. 19 was okay. 20 is very intense. So it's very hard to predict it upfront. It's a little bit of how the market is, how your business is performing, how you are performing relative to what your investors are expecting, and so on. So the intensity level varies a lot. But on average, I would say it's worse than probably the worst job that you can think of. So if you're taking a startup because you want an easy life and you think it's my business and I can do it when I want, rethink it. Right? Good. Any other questions? I know we're significantly out of time.
So I think Karthik, you really was quite interactive and nice. Thanks a lot for your time. And we don't want to spoil your work-life balance anymore on a Sunday afternoon.
Thanks, Satya. So very nice being here, and good luck to all of you. So, Satya, one of the things is if there are teams which are at specific points of time in smaller groups. So, for example, somebody who's already picked up a problem and they are kind of trying to figure out whether they've reached product market fit or so on. Happy to kind of advise smaller teams, but they need to be at a point at which they can bring something very structured. It's very hard to give broad advice